Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're super excited that we have Ashley Steimer-King here with us today from Girls Learn International. So I'm going to read her bio and then we'll jump right into the first question. Ashley Steimer-King is the Senior Program Director of Girls Learn International, or GLI, a project of the Feminist Majority Foundation. Ashley graduated with an MA in Cultural Anthropology from Roehampton University in London, completing her thesis on gender-based violence and grassroots feminist protests. She previously worked with several NGOs in their United Nations offices, training middle and high school students on international human rights learning and advocacy. She proudly leads the GLI team, delivering year-round programming for thousands of middle and high school student activists. So thank you again for joining us. We're so glad that you're here to talk to us.
Thank you, Mayna. I'm excited to be here with a wonderful high school activist.
So my first question is a little bit about your background. You made a decision many years ago to focus on women's advancement, gender equity, and human rights. If you wouldn't mind, would you please share with our listeners your motivations? Was there a specific event, a specific person that inspired you, or both, or something else?
Yeah, I'm going to give you two stories. The first starts when I was probably about 7 years old. So it would have been 1988. I'll just date myself right from the outside here. I grew up with I grew up one of three sisters. My mom used to wake us up early on the day of the marathon to take us to watch the start of the women's marathon, which starts before the men's marathon. It's really early in the morning. And she would wake us all up. She would get us hot chocolates. We would kind of bundle up if it was cold, and we would go down to where they started the women's marathon really early in the morning to see these women runners. She had read in Ms. It was only a few decades before that women were fighting for the right to be able to run in a marathon. They weren't allowed to until 1967 when the first woman ran in the Boston Marathon. And so she had read about this in Ms. and how this was, even that, just being able to run in a marathon was a relatively recent development in women's rights. And so I remember that. I remember seeing those women running. It didn't turn me into a runner, for sure. But it did turn me into a feminist, and I think that was one of the first moments when my eyes were sort of open to the fact that women didn't always have the same rights as men in the US, and that there were still areas of progress that we needed to undertake for women and other socially oppressed groups. And so that was definitely one of my first moments. I think that was a feminist click moment, as they call it. And then in graduate school, I was working with organizations, like you said, at the United Nations. We were working on girls' rights issues. So a girls' rights issue is anything that happens specifically to girls. So not necessarily to women, not necessarily to boys, but so these are things like early child marriage, forced marriage, um, FGM, which is female genital mutilation or female genital cutting. And so we were working on these issues and we were talking a lot about them, but and these were all good things to be working on. Don't get me wrong, but we were doing so violating kind of one of the first principles of human rights work, in that the people that are impacted by the work you're doing should be in the room making those decisions. So we were doing all this work for girls on behalf of girls without girls ever stepping foot into the United Nations or being in those halls where those decisions are being made. And so started working with some other groups, the Girl Scouts, to bring girls themselves to the United Nations more frequently, to be there when decisions are being made, to be seen and heard and talked to about their thoughts and opinions and experiences. And so I think that continues to inspire me to make sure that wherever we're talking about the rights of a group of people, that those people are also in the room with us.
Yeah, I love that inclusivity part of it. And even as we were talking about before we started recording, how the feminist majority and Girls Learn is a partner in trying to get women there. So I really appreciate your work on that. I want to specifically ask you about Girls Learn International. And if you could tell us why it was created, I know we touched a little bit on this, but its focus areas and where you see its mission evolving in 2025.
Absolutely. So, Girls Learn has been student led from the start. Girls Learn was created in 2003. There were two teenagers, Jordana and Ariel, and their mom, whose name is Lisa, and they were learning about a number of human rights situations that they were hearing about in the US and also internationally. They were reading the newspaper, and they realized that while they maybe were being exposed to human rights violations, they were learning about them, most of their peers were not, and they weren't familiar with what was happening and the situation for women and girls in the US and in other parts of the world. And so they decided, I think rightly so, that the number one thing to do before you take action is to educate yourself and to help educate your peers. So they created Girls Learn in order to both understand issues that impact their own lives, the lives of other girls around the world, and then to take action on those issues in their own community. And so they started learning about things like sex ed and why it's important to have comprehensive sex education. They started learning about things like Title IX in the US, that we don't have the Equal Rights Amendment still in the US. And they started learning about some of the situations for girls in Afghanistan at that time in 2003. And now today are, many human rights violations happening to girls and women in Afghanistan. So they started this chapter model. So any student teacher could start a GLI chapter in their school or community to learn about issues through a human rights lens, learn about feminist issues through a human rights lens, and then to take action to help improve that issue in their community or to raise awareness about it, depending on what the issue is. Many of our chapters today are interested in sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we have a lot of chapters that are interested in things like sex ed, that are interested in abortion rights, the right to birth control, the right, this sort of larger framework of reproductive justice, which means like you have the right to control when and if you have a family. Um, and so a lot of students are interested in working on that. We have a lot of students now that are interested in gun violence and how that intersects with gender. The presence of a gun in a home increases the situation for a woman or a girl living in that home exponentially. It increases the danger for a woman or girl living in that home exponentially. So interested in gun control issues and how that might impact them at school as well. So we have a wide community of chapters that are interested in a wide variety of issues, and our job as GLI is to provide information, support, resources, opportunities for developing leadership skills, opportunities for developing that issue-based knowledge, and connecting these student activists with each other. We do that through a variety of ways. In 2011, we became a part of the Feminist Majority Foundation. So we got access to this kind of larger umbrella of all these different other programs and organizations working for women, the rights of women and girls, including Ms. Magazine, the National Clinic Access Program Project, which works with reproductive health clinics around the country, the campaign to stop gender apartheid in Afghanistan with my Afghan colleague, whose name is Makfi. And so we were able to collaborate with these other parts of the Feminist Majority Foundation on these human rights issues.
And something I kind of want to ask you while we're on the topic of human rights and education in general and the importance of it. I know for many of us, and I think even for me, human rights seems a little bit abstract and a topic that we might only associate when we're talking about war or socioeconomically disadvantaged populations. Like if you think about Ukraine or the Middle East right now and all of those conflicts that are going on. So I was wondering if you could share with us GLI's approach to human rights. And I know you mentioned creating chapters, so also including any efforts to increase awareness on the importance of human rights and perhaps even the broader definition of it in general.
Absolutely. I really love this question, and I think you're right. I think so many people most people think about human rights as something that is abstract and not connected to their lives at all. And so what we work on in GLI, and what we train chapters to do is to start thinking about, you can think about every moment of your own personal day through a human rights lens, right? So you woke up, you woke up in a home, or you woke up houseless. You woke up with access to food, which is one of your human rights, or you woke up without access to food, one of your human rights. You woke up in a safe environment where your bodily integrity was protected, or you didn't, right? So you have all of these moments of your day where you can see whether your human rights are being protected or not protected, and you can see where the gaps in human rights protections might lie. And so I think that the first thing we always talk about when we talk about human rights is looking at our own lives, and then we go out just a little bit. So we look at our community, right? So if we can look through our day and see all these places where human rights are being protected, what about our neighbors? What about people that live, in our neighborhood? Do they have access to housing? Do they have access to food? Are they being protected? Are they at greater risk of violence? So I can look throughout my day and see many instances where my human rights are being protected. But then I think about there are a couple of um, I believe trans sex workers that live in my neighborhood. I don't think they have a home, and I think that they're probably at much greater risk of violence given the nature of the work that they do and their gender identity. And so I can look, right outside my door and see that there are communities of people whose human rights are not being protected based on things like their gender identity and the other things that put them at greater risk. And so we want to there's a great quote by Eleanor Roosevelt, who says that human rights start in those small places close to home. And especially when we look at violence and gender-based violence, we know that you're most likely to be a victim of gender-based violence, which is, of course, a human rights issue, when you are at home, right, from an intimate partner most of the time. And so we're looking at those issues, and we're working with young people to understand how human rights intersects with their lives in a lot of different ways. I mean, I'll give you another example. In the US, Black and brown girls are about 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls are. So this is an issue that impacts, girls in the United States in many of our schools. And so we're helping students understand those statistics and how they might impact their own lives in their own communities. And then, of course, you can draw parallels to places like Ukraine, Afghanistan, where girls' human rights are not being protected in possibly, more obvious ways, but still the parallels of human rights protections are there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, and I kind of want to have a follow-up on that a little bit. As we're talking about, how important it is to look at your neighbor and your neighborhood first in your local environment. As girls become more aware of that, and if they decide to pursue that course of study or profession, are there subjects and majors which you'd recommend that we focus on to hone in on that, and also just further educate ourselves to become more knowledgeable and play a more important role in fighting this?
Absolutely. Oh, such good questions, man. I love these. I love these questions. There are so many there are so many ways to go with this. And while we're on this subject, when I talk to young people about choosing a college, choosing a major, it can seem like there's one path to get from point A to point B. There are so many paths to get from point A to point B. And often we tell our stories in reverse, with the gift of hindsight, where we can say, oh, I did this and this and this on purpose, and it led me here, right? Um, that's not always the way it actually is in practice, and that a lot of our paths are windier than maybe we realize that they're going to be. So I think there's lots of paths to get there. I studied cultural anthropology, which is maybe not necessarily a direct connection to human rights or to feminism, but it was interesting because, seeing the way people set up societies, seeing the way that there are many, many different ways that people set up their societies and live their lives actually is really connected to feminism and human rights, because it doesn't have to be the way that we've made it so far, right? It can be, we can change because people throughout history have done it many different ways. And so, I think it's more important to find what kind of lights you up inside, what makes you excited. That might be journalism, that might be political science. I talked to a student a while ago who was, had gone through the GLI program, had been to the UN, was really excited about human rights protections and feminism and all of that. But she had always wanted to be an economist. Her parents were both economists. And she said to me, well, can I be like a feminist economist? I was like, yes, you can absolutely be a feminist economist, and you should be, right? Because that was the area, economic equality was the area of feminism that was most interesting to her. And so I think that that is what is most important, is finding, kind of taking the lens and then finding the area that you feel like personally um, is most important and get you the most excited, right? Nobody wants to be, if you're going to be up studying all night, if you're going to be writing a million papers, it's hard, right? It should be hard. It should be challenging and exciting. You need to have that fire to kind of get you through, I think, or to be the most successful as you could be. So that's my advice. I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking for, but that's what I think.
No, I love that. I love that message of self-fulfillment and being passionate about your work, because that will bring you the most happiness and you'll be the most successful in that field. And I think all of that really also stems from a place of advocacy and wanting to better the world. And so I want to ask you specifically about youth advocacy, especially coming out of this election cycle where youth were really present and wanted their voices heard. And there was a significant push by the younger generation, both in terms of young people stepping up and in the topics that will most affect us and will affect us for the longest also, like sustainability and the legal structure underlying our democracy and democracies across the world, the rights of LGBTQIA plus adolescents, and the list goes on. So I wanted to ask you if you're also seeing this push from your vantage point as well, and what can we do to further support that and make sure that that movement just gets stronger and that our voices continue to be heard?
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say, I'm so excited that the world is finally waking up to the fact that young people are advocates for themselves. I feel like it's something that's been happening for a long time, but it's only in recent years that there's been more recognition of the work that young people are doing and more understanding of how important youth advocacy is. I feel like it was probably back with the Parkland survivors and that movement for gun control, um, where I finally started hearing a lot of people saying like, oh, wow, there's like this huge push by young people. And I'm like, yes, welcome to it. Like we've been here for a while, like I've been seeing it for a long time in our young leaders that I work with and in the young leaders that other organizations I work with know. And so I I think it's important to recognize that, some of the things I said earlier, that young people have the right to be in the rooms where decisions are made about their lives. They have the right to be on. I think we should lower the voting age to 16. That's just my opinion.
Me too.
Yeah. Young people, if you go to a school and decisions are being made at the school board, young people have the right to be in those rooms where the school boards are making their decisions. I think that, we advocate for a student representative on the school board. They did that in Los Angeles. They've done that in a couple of other places where they have a student seat on the school board. I think that that's really important. And if you go to, an independent school, there are ways to, have student representation in the governance of the school. And so I think it's our job as old people, opposite of young people, to, you know, I don't think it's necessarily empowerment that's important. Yes, like leadership training is important, issue knowledge training is important, but I think that we really do have to create a space, a physical space, often a seat at a table. Um, and I know that there is advice, if there's no seat at the table, pull up a chair or stool or something. There's some quote that says like what to do if there isn't a seat at the table, but I think that that's harder when you're a younger person. And I think that it's our job to make sure that we're creating those seats and those spaces. And sometimes that means removing ourselves, right? I think it's really good advice to other people who are my age to remove yourself from a panel if there's a young person who can speak about their own work from their own perspective. I also try to do that with, if I'm asked to speak on a panel, I ask about the diversity of the panel. And if it's all white people, I don't want to, I step down from that panel so that somebody with, a different perspective can step up. So I think we always have to be aware of the spaces that we're occupying and try to make sure that we're stepping back so that other people can step forward to give their own perspective. So that's some of my answer. I'm really excited about the more recognition being given to youth activism. And I think that I don't see young people as apathetic. I don't see them as getting more apathetic. If anything, I just think it's going in the right direction. And so I don't know that other than making space and continuing to acknowledge the work that young people are doing, that we really need to do anything else in order to keep the ball rolling.
Yeah, and I'm very hopeful as well. I think I've gotten to meet a lot of really cool people who are really involved, like through working on the election and also just in school, just the amount of people who started watching the news even more because they realize how much these issues will directly affect us. I think is really inspiring to see. And I want to briefly go back to when you were talking about sex education. And as you were talking about, like for many of us, sex ed was taught at school, but the quality or the effectiveness of that program is really dependent on so many different things, like the background of the teachers or the amount of time that the school dedicates to it, or just the resources they have in general. And so I wanted to ask you if you could frame this issue in the context of both challenges and opportunities as we go into 2025. So what are the issues both in the US and other countries, specifically about sex ed, that we should really inform people about and start targeting?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the places where the US really needs to look at the way that other countries have handled sex ed and follow the lead of many, many other countries. In almost everywhere, sexual health education is taught as a health issue, right? It's sort of taught as these are facts, this is information, this is medically accurate information. It hasn't been politicized to a place where we are debating what facts students are allowed to talk about at school. And so I think that, there's just so much room for us to follow the lead of other countries and to see, how they've done it here. I mean, in the US, there's a whole map that I can send you that talks about all the different state laws. You have really wildly different situations for sex ed in different parts of the country. In the US, 13 states don't require sex ed to be medically accurate. You do not have to give medically accurate information, and they don't, right? They talk about all sorts of things that are not medically accurate. And so I think that empowering students to learn about the situation in their state and in neighboring states, and this goes to now with abortion rights and looking at what are the laws in my state, because these things are all have all changed pretty rapidly since Roe v. Wade was overturned. And so what are the laws in my state regarding sex ed? What are the laws in my state regarding abortion, birth control rights? What are the laws in my neighboring states? Because that's really important when you're talking about especially abortion rights. And how can I get information out to people that I know about how to access services if it's not something that's provided in my state. I tell since 2021, I've been telling everybody about Plan C, which is a website where you can get access to mifepristone, which is the abortion pill, and you can, no matter what state you live in, and there are networks of ways to get these services. And so I think that's really important. And I think sex ed at the end of the day is like the right to understand, one of the human rights is the right to understand your rights. And so I think sex ed is primarily about understanding our own bodies, understanding what consent really means, understanding what sexual assault is, understanding the right to be protected in our own bodies, and the right to live free from violence. And so I think that there's a lot of great work being done on comprehensive sex ed. If anybody is really passionate about sex ed and advocating for sex ed at the local level, there's a great organization called Educate Us that trains students, parents, teachers, anyone to go to school board meetings, speak up on state level bills, local bills that are impacting sex ed in their school. It is a real place in the US that we need to pay attention to because, in I guess it was probably 2022, that Moms for Liberty group was trying to overtake school boards and limit sex ed, limit information about accurate histories of race and justice in the US, and really try to push for just real limitations on what students can and can't talk about at school. And that bothers me. I hate that.
That's really surprising that there are states that don't require their information to be medically correct.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
not good. No. I'll send you this map. It's really interesting when you start to look at the state laws regarding sex ed and how there are folks who are kind of coming for sex ed, racial justice education, gender justice education. They go there first, right?
Yeah.
You can interrupt people from understanding their rights in high school, middle school, then you've done half the job, right? So yeah, it's interesting for sure.
Yeah. So branching off that, then I guess my follow-up question to that would be, what are the specific places, like domestically and globally, that you see need the most information?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. Yeah. Um, I guess I would say that, you know, there's nowhere that doesn't need information, although
Right.
there are certainly places where it's protected a lot more. I mean, unfortunately, I do think a lot of the southern states, I live in Louisville, Kentucky now. Louisville itself is a blue dot. And so the city of Louisville has relatively good sex education in the schools, as far as I've been able to tell so far. But then when you go outside these major cities in southern states, there's a lot of I had a friend who worked for the school district in Oldham County, which is just sort of one county over from Jefferson County where Louisville is. And there are a lot of newly arrived immigrants and a lot of English language learners. And there was a lot of um illegal just moves to try to stop this population of people from getting access to the resources that they need to be successful at school. a lot of racism, xenophobia, with real world impacts on real students who are just trying to get an education like everybody else. And so I do think that we need to be looking at the local level because we can make the most immediate change there at these school boards, down to county level, state level. And I think the best way to do that is to look where we live and then where our in the areas surrounding where we live. Just like you look at human rights, starting with yourself and then branching out to neighboring communities.
So I want to ask then, you just mentioned starting with your school board and your local communities. Are there specific actions or things we should be advocating for in those areas to get legislation passed or certain efforts to help combat this?
Yeah, and that again that question for me again goes back to what are you most passionate about? So if you're looking at sex ed, which is something that I'm passionate about and that a lot of the students GLI works with are, you look at, okay, what is the actual what's the state law? What does the state law say or doesn't say that our school should be teaching about sex ed if we go to a public school? And then are they doing it? So are they in compliance? Is it a good law? Is it saying that information should be medically accurate, comprehensive, inclusive of other sexualities, um, consent based? And are they complying with that law? Because a lot of the times you might find that the school board might not be in compliance with the state law. Or is the state law the problem? Do we need to, can we go to the state house? Can we talk to a friendly legislator in our state to say, we don't like the kind of sex ed we're getting, and can you do better? And can we try to advocate at the state level? So I think it depends on your situation, but that's why it's good that Girls Learn exists, Educate Us exists if you're specifically interested in sex ed. There are a million organizations, and I'm happy to refer any student that wants to get involved in a certain issue to an organization that would really help them to make change at the state or local level. There's a great organization in California called Gen Up that is working with students, high school and college students, on bills within California and connecting them directly to legislators to write better bills and to protect their rights. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot to do. um yeah, I was gonna say one other thing. I always think it's a good idea, no matter where you live, to, especially if you go to a public school, to look up when your school board meetings are and just start going to the meetings. And you don't, you might not be ready to say anything right away. Usually you have to file to be a speaker, but go and see what they're saying. One of our GLI chapters in California in the Coachella Valley just sends GLI representatives to every school board meeting to sit there and see what they're saying and start to be involved in that way. So yes,
Yeah.
that's my recommendation. It's one of my recommendations.
No, I really love that piece that you just kind of keep talking about, is like the involvement and making sure that you're at least in the room and the people that need to be there whose lives are affected by this are there and present. So I kind of want to take that and zoom out a little bit and talk about like the attentions and the energies that are dedicated towards women's causes in general. And ask you, I know we talked about like very briefly in the beginning about the ERA and how, that's still something that we're talking about, but I feel like the momentum on that has shifted a little bit. So talking about 2025 and 2026, what are GLI's main priorities in the US and abroad?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
I know it's
Um,
a broad one also.
it's a broad one and it's a tough one. Yeah. Unfortunately, I think that when you have a Trump administration, I don't like to be on the defensive, right? We like to be making progress and kind of leading progress to see like where could we do, we're doing great in these areas, where could we do better? That's what I would like for us. Unfortunately, I think that during the second Trump administration, we're really going to have to play defense a lot. I think we're going to have to be looking at where they're trying to roll back rights and pushing back as much as we can in any way that we can. And so, and again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it is not that we should definitely let our federal representatives are in Congress, you know, the Trump administration know how we feel about the actions that we're taking. However, I always argue that it's more effective if you can work at the state and local level because you have greater contact with those representatives. I haven't met a state representative that hasn't been willing to meet. I mean, maybe not with the representative themselves, but with staff. I think there's just, you can make greater inroads at the state and local level. And I think especially when you have an administration like the Trump administration, you have the greatest chance of pushing back in those places closer to home.
And I'm sorry.
No, no.
Okay. I just want to make sure I didn't cut you off. That kind of leads perfectly into my last question and a little bit of advice for anyone who's listening right now and is like, I just want to really get involved with GLI. What is the first place that you'd direct them to?
Oh, I love that. That's great. So, if this sounds like a shameless plug for GLI, it kind of is, but
No, go ahead.
So any student or teacher can start a chapter. We like our chapters to be student led, particularly at the high school level. You can get a friend, do it yourself if you don't have a friend that wants to work on these issues with you, and go on the GLI website, apply to start a chapter. It's free to start a chapter. All of our program materials are free. All of our programming is free. There's no fees involved. So anybody that's interested in learning more about gender equity, human rights, can apply to start a chapter at their school. And then you just, you can set up an appointment with myself or my colleague Eliana, who does chapter development work, and talk about how you want to implement it. We have trainings, I'll just brag quickly on our GLI guidebook. It's a online resource that students use to lead chapter meetings. It's the only peer-led human rights gender equity curriculum I've seen. So it's written to students to lead with groups of their peers. So instead of most curriculum is written to teachers to implement in a classroom, which is also good if you have a teacher that can do that. That's wonderful. But we like to put the power and control in the hands of students. So it's written so that students can take the section on Human Rights 101, or take the section on gender and climate change, or take the section on any one of the 50 topic areas we have, and that same day lead a meeting of their peers to talk about the issue and start to take action on it. So that's all available for our chapters as well. So that's my GLI pitch. But if I always say if GLI isn't quite right for you, if there's something different that you're passionate about, or you want to have a different kind of experience, I come into contact with a lot of other nonprofits that have programming for high school students, and I'm always willing to put you in touch with another organization that might be doing it, doing something a little slightly differently. And so we can talk about that as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time on a Saturday morning. I really appreciate everything.
No problem. It was nice to talk with you.
You
Hope
too.
you have a good rest of your day.
I'm always bad at ending this thing.